Today we're going to go over Wilfrid Sellars' essay, Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. Sellars is a analytic philosopher, although he does utilize some parts of continental philosophy, in particular idealism such as Kant and Hegel. And you'll kind of see that come out in this video, in this essay rather. And we're going to talk about basically, we're going to go over his main thesis, which is kind of critiquing this idea of epistemological givenness or self-evident truths. Now, this is kind of what he's known for, and when I was first reading this essay, I was searching for supplementary videos just to kind of help me get along because, I'm not that familiar with analytic philosophy, and it is very technical in the way it's written out. It is written out with, symbols and all this, so I didn't really understand it at first, and I had to read um, Brandam's essay the on Sellers' essay to make sense of it, which even then it was still a little bit confusing. So it took me a while. In the matter of like a week and a half, I was able to just kind of break it down, and I wanted to put out a video for people who were looking at this essay, didn't understand it, and would just kind of make things more coherent. So without further ado, I have some notes here that I took a little while ago. We're going to go over them. It's going to be another one of those free-form videos, and we're just going to kind of make his essay more comprehensible. We're going to be going over the myth of the given, which is the crux, I would say, of the essay, and kind of the part of Sellers that everyone is concerned with, and then we're going to go over um, the logic of looks and the way he thinks language and thought relate to one another. So, starting with the myth of the given, just to give some background here, in the empiricist tradition, the primary epistemology is foundationalism. This epistemology asserts that in order for knowledge to be possible, there must be a set of truths which are by their very nature self-evident and justified by their own accord. So they don't really need any external justification. They are, as propositions, self-attesting, self-justifying. You don't need to appeal to anything further. This is what they claim, the empiricists, and not just empiricists. There's also a rationalist way this could be understood as a set of axioms, uh, irrefutable axioms. You kind of see this, I guess you could say, in Aristotle, maybe a little bit, and also in 'cause I mean, Aristotle is a foundationalist, um, but also in like some Thomistic philosophies as well. Not entirely, but there could also be a rationalist sort of version of foundationalism. And well, we're going to be more concerned here with the empiricist rendition of this because this is what Sellers is attacking. Because at the time in the 50s, this was like, I guess you could say, sort of a mainstream epistemology when it came to philosophy, which is interesting. Um, but nonetheless, he does give a really good critique of it. I would say he's probably, if you're going to look at the analytic philosophy, look into Sellers and Gödel, but especially Sellers. So just continuing on here, the empiricist holds that sense data, that is sensation, our experience or whatever you want to call it, is that which is the given, which is self-evident. And this is the basis for all knowledge. This is otherwise known as non-inferential knowing, which just means direct knowing and knowing that is not inferred from something else. So, for example, um, non-inferential knowing would be if there is an apple in front of me and I say, well, this apple is in front of me because I see there is an apple in front of me. I'm not inferring that from anything else. I'm just reporting my sensation. Now, an inferential sort of claim would be, I believe there was an apple here because there is the smell of an apple that has been opened or something like that. Or if there was like a dog, there are footprints of a dog here. Therefore, there is a dog somewhere around the area. So I'm inferring from the footprints, my sensation of the footprints, that there is a dog somewhere else. Um, Now that this is more when it comes to empiricism. This is more where it becomes more concerned with the self-attesting truth, which is sensation for these empiricists. So the empiricist often holds two positions regarding the relation of sense data to knowledge, and that is the first being atomism, not atomism in the materialist sense, but in a epistemological, isolated sense, meaning the notion that empirical observation of one object is independent of another empirical observation. So, for example, the green door is independent of any other empirical knowledge. So, in order for me to know there's a green door, I don't really need to know anything else except that there's a green door there. and it's separate from other uh, empirical knowledge, according to the empiricists. So then we have the adjudication thesis, which is that graspings of sensations are the quote unquote ultimate court of appeals for knowledge. So by graspings, they mean taking your sensation and turning it into a sort of statement or proposition. That's the ultimate appeal for knowledge. So we should note here that, um, again, there is a distinction between graspings and the sensation. So graspings can also kind of be understood as concept formation. I see a red dog, I create the concept, the notion of the red dog in my mind, and from there I'm able to reason and make conclusions about the red dog, say things about the red dog, have a general understanding of what a red dog is. This is where the Hegelianism sort of comes in for Sellars, and it's really pretty straightforward. Uh, and that is, Hegel makes this distinction in the phenomenology of spirit that that distinction being between the understanding and sense perception. So sense perception for Hegel is the lowest form of consciousness, which is basically just uh, experiencing phenomena. That's the lowest form of consciousness, is just experience. A higher form of consciousness is relating your experience or your experiences to one another, taking the world and dividing it into different categories by what you observe. That would be what Hegel calls the understanding. So you begin to sort of you have an experience, but then you start to, and like for Hegel, it's like this experience is very uh immediate. It's immediacy, it's experience of immediacy, which is to say he's concerned with like your very low level of experience, your conscious experience is just this sort of movement. It's the movement through time. You can infinitely divide time, and thus you can infinitely divide your experiences which occur through time, is kind of what Hegel means by sense perception. But then you have the higher level of consciousness, which is the understanding, and the understanding sort of has two levels to it in a way which is interesting because he makes this distinction between knowing the object, like here is a book, and then relating the object, which you now know, which is the book, to other objects. Here's a book, and here's the library, which the book rests within, and there's a bunch of other books that it relates to. So that's the sort of two layered, or rather two tiered um, aspect of the Hegelian notion of the understanding. And Sellers uses that when understanding the difference between graspings and sensations. So sensations would just be the same thing as sense perception, and graspings would be sort of proper to the Hegelian understanding. So, in order to have the graspings, you'd have to have this sort of higher level of consciousness, which is the understanding. So, moving on here, Sellers rejects both thesis 1 and thesis 2 of the empiricist, that is the atomism and the adjudication thesis. And furthermore, with the notion that graspings of sensations are the ultimate foundation for knowledge, is what he rejects when it comes to the adjudication thesis. So, we're going to explain more of that here. So first, we're going to start with the refutation of atomism, which, just to refresh your memory, atomism um, is basically stating that you can know empirical objects without reference to other empirical objects. So if I have a green door, well, I don't need to know anything else except my sensation of that green door to know that there's a green door there. So, and this is obviously a non-inferential sort of a form of knowledge, and which means it's direct experience. And then you have the grasping of the green door, which does in fact entail other empirical knowledge. For example, green and door are two distinct empirical categories because a door doesn't necessarily have to be green, and green there can be other things which are green that are not doors. There's money, like an apple could be green, um, grass. These are all green things, so that you actually do come to the table with other empirical notions when you do observe the green door. So yes, there are uh, other entailed empirical truths. And you can't really say green is not an empirical truth either, or door is not an empirical truth, because door and greenness can only be known through experience, really. Um, I mean, you can't like try to explain green to somebody in a purely rationalistic sense without appealing to sight or anything of this nature. Now, often that atomist thing was promoted by Bertrand Russell, and Sellers rejects this basically because he's gonna provide a sort of different paradigm for us to understand. Now, his refutation of the thesis of adjudication, now remember this one states that graspings of sensations are the ultimate court of appeals for knowledge. The issue Sellers has with this is that even graspings themselves, while yes caused by sensations, do not epistemologically work as a justification. Now we're going to break down the refutation of the thesis of adjudication because we just broke down the refutation of empirical atomism or epistemological atomism as well. So this is by no means the full, rigorous, analytical, and like modal logic version of his refutation. This is just sort of a simplification of it, but this is going to hopefully make it easier to digest for those of you who are reading this paper and don't fully understand it. So, one, justifications for knowledge must be propositional, or in other words, a statement, in order for them to be a justification. So, just to clarify here a little bit, in order for a justification to be a justification, it must be a proposition, because justifications are a linguistic endeavor. They're something that occurs through the medium of language, and they must be a statement. Sensations are not propositions, they are an experience. So, sorry, that was two. Three, sensations are not a justification because justifications are propositions and sensations are not propositions. Four, graspings of sensations have no justification, whilst attempting to search for one which is contrary to its givenness, as this implies it is not self-evident. Therefore, graspings cannot be the ultimate court of appeal. So just to clarify a little bit further here, graspings are the sensation put into linguistic form. However, there's no way to fill the gap between sensation and linguistic form because in order to have or rather a linguistic affirmation, I should say, because a linguistic affirmation is attempting to make a truth claim. There's no way to fill the gap between sensation and a linguistic or propositional affirmation because in order to make a propositional affirmation, you would need another proposition in order to justify that propositional affirmation. So then we have a problem here. Uh, Sensations are not propositional affirmations, so they can't lead to the graspings, which are the quote unquote self evident truths, because graspings themselves are unjustified propositional affirmations, which is epistemologically invalid. So I don't know if that makes perfect sense, but just to kind of give you a picture here, if I'm going to justify something, I'm going to appeal to a statement, a logical statement. Now, if I'm going to try and have a self evident truth that I'm going to base all justifications off of, such as a grasping, well, the problem is that grasping itself has no basis because in order for it to have a basis, it would need to be based on a proposition, not a sensation. So that's the issue here. However, let's say sensations are propositions in order that one could try and use them to justify graspings, which is kind of what we were talking about. Again, the problem would still be present as we would have to subject all experience or claims or phenomenological claims to this thing called quote unquote normative assessment to determine if true, and uh, by the way, normative assessment means being the ability to distinguish if our experience is illusory or corresponding to the world accurately. So if we do want to use, if we want to subject graspings to normative assessment, well then we have another issue because normative assessment would be the next court of appeals, and then the graspings wouldn't be the final court of appeals as they've been made out to be. And secondly, normative assessment itself presupposes a set of epistemological axioms and all these other sort of epistemic things which are uh, not self-evident. So now we're going outside the given to try and justify it, which is contradictory to the nature of a supposed given. Now, just to clarify, the issue regarding the given is twofold. The first being sensation, whilst causal, cannot be used as a justification because it is not a proposition, rather a mental state. All justifications must be a proposition, all of them, or else they can't be justifications. Now, a self-evident truth is also said to be a justification for other truths, but it can't be a justification if the self-evident truth itself has no basis, um, or the self-evident truth is not a sort of oh, there's no gap to fill between the sensation and the grasping, and the self-evident truth has no sort of, I guess you could say, epistemological atomism. Now, the second part of this is that graspings of sensations, and again, graspings are propositions. Remember that. But this proposition itself is impossible to justify because it has no proposition to which we could use to verify and its veracity. We can't just leave that unjustified because it would still presuppose other concepts which are required for it to be true. It would also be arbitrary just to leave it unjustified. Like, why just leave this unjustified, um, and not leave other things unjustified? It seems pretty arbitrary as well. Well, it doesn't seem, it is. So this brings us into our next part of this, the logic of looks, where we're going to focus a little bit more here on sensation. So even when we try and use sense experience, it leads to an incoherent set of conclusions. So when we say object X appears red, therefore it is red, just because something appears red doesn't necessarily mean it is red in reality. I mean, it could very well be mistaken, and your experience doesn't necessarily correspond to reality as it is. I mean, illusions are a thing. People hallucinate on drugs. So just because you sense something doesn't necessarily mean that it is there. Not to mention, once again, the notion of red is something that already is a concept. It's a concept we already hold before coming to a an affirmation of some given or whatever. So if you once again if you see a red apple, well, you already have a notion of red in your head as a concept that this notion of red transcends all its individual particularizations, and you sort of have this it's more than a grasping. It's become an abstract ontology that you've sort of created. Now, if you're a Platonist, you could sort of explain that in a different way, but again, in this context, we're kind of talking about uh, empiricism. So, if one says the apple is red because it appears to me as red, this claim is actually not coherent because once again, something appearing to you as red doesn't mean it follows necessarily to be red in reality. Um, Now, it should be noted here, this is much different than the claim, this apple appears to me as if it was red. This is fine, and you can't really be wrong about how something appears to you. And you aren't saying it is red because it appears to you as red. You're just saying that it is appearing to me as red, but not necessarily that it is red in reality. So it's kind of hard to be wrong about that. I mean, maybe you could sort of say that, well, you're mistaking what red is, but then again, this already presupposes red, and how are you going to have this notion of red between different subjects? That's a whole nother issue. But the main important distinction here is the distinction between endorsement and the reporting of a phenomenon. Now, endorsement is saying this exists in reality. Reporting a phenomenon is just simply reporting the experience you're having of reality. So those are two separate things. No empirical theory can explain this, that being something can look red or any color, um, or possess any of those qualities without actually having them. So if we rely on observation, how then can we come to the conclusions about these things if their qualities can just be mere appearances and not objective facts? So how does that explain that? How does empiricism explain that, rather? You can't say that our knowledge of whether or not something is red is dependent on our senses, as our senses are not that which determines if something is corresponding to reality, because our senses can generate things that are not in reality, such as illusions, and illusions are something that do exist as illusions. So at most, you can say our knowledge that something is appearing to be red is based on our senses, as appearance is proper to the senses, but not to the noumenal pole of existence, or, yeah. So this is important. This is where Kant comes in again for we saw where Hegel came in for Sellars. Now this is where Kant comes in. Is that you can sense something as red in the world of phenomenon or just the world of experience, but again, it doesn't. There's no necessary correlation that your experience of red is actually the same thing as red being there. Now, moving on from this, we're going to move on to our last section here, which is the relation of thought to language. So, the standard view of the way thought relates to language is that our thoughts come first, and then we use language to explain our thoughts. So, for example, when I was young, my mother pointed to a brown, fluffy object and said, "That's a dog." And during this period, I had a series of thoughts, and then I was able to relate the sound dog to the brown, fluffy object, and then from then on, I referred to that brown, fluffy object as dog. Well, Sellers actually rejects this, and it seems counterintuitive actually once you first hear it, because like how else would you come up with language, or if you didn't have the thoughts first to apply the words to, or how could you even come up with words without thinking of the words or making them up? But we're going to see why this actually makes sense. So, what is language, firstly? Well, language is a means of communication, obviously, with other people, and oneself. Eh, eh, a person uses language as a tool to communicate between people and oneself, basically. And but like if you really want to be rigorous when it comes to language, language is a tool which categorizes and divides the world around us and helps us make sense of things. So, with this in mind, Sellers states that language comes before thought. Counterintuitive, I'm aware, but here's why. Thoughts themselves categorize and divide the world, and in order to participate in categorization, one must have a language in order to do this. This must be the case in order to even distinguish things conceptually, as concepts presuppose language, and all thoughts are a form of concept. Thoughts are a linguistic affair because any thought presupposes a category, a distinction, and categorization itself requires language, no matter how primitive. This doesn't even have to be a written language or have some sort of noise to it. It's just merely that in order to distinguish between A and B, you have to have a sort of concept of A and B. And once you have a concept, you have a sort of language, a sort of something that can be communicated. So this is the point he's making. So yes, even babies would have this too, as babies do communicate and have internal dialogue in the sense that they are dividing the world into categories themselves. This is why we're um, whether even able to feel fear and happiness in relation to objects, or even right at birth. And it's also why a baby is also able to distinguish between its mother and some other woman, because they have the ability to categorize and divide the world. And this right here is a linguistic phenomenon, and um, it is through this act of categorization and division, which is the act of language, that thoughts are produced. Now, thoughts and language both divide up the world and are necessarily connected to one another. It should also be stated that thoughts can't be said to be the same as sensations, as thoughts are propositions, and I mean, they're statements. So even if they're internal, it's still a statement, and not necessarily a sensation. But um, just because it is a proposition doesn't necessarily mean it's a justification. So all justifications are propositions, but not all propositions are justifications. So, for example, X therefore Y is a justification, but um, is a justification and a proposition. But I am hungry is just a proposition and not necessarily a justification. So that's a basic gist of Sellers. I hope that kind of clear a lot of things up. I know when I was trying to, go through his essay, I was having quite a difficult time. There was not a lot of videos on YouTube kind of getting down to it. There was like I found one video by this guy, Jonathan Quanig, I think is how you say his last name. And that was a great video that helped a lot. So I recommend that video. But this is more of a shortened down version of that. And there's one by Monovac, I think, as well, which is also good, but kind of messy. So hopefully this clears things up for those of you getting new to the essay. It's kind of hard. Take your time with it. Read the Brandom essay on it, and yeah, that's it.